So it's now my great pleasure, everyone, to introduce my friend and co-tour leader, David Henderson. David is a fabulous artist. He's won many awards for his gorgeous paintings. Look up his website if you want to see what they're like. I know that many ASA travellers have purchased paintings done by David, which give them gorgeous memories of the travels that they have done with him. David is also an acclaimed art historian. So to hear David explain a painting or a statue is always an absolute treat. And of course, he has been an ASA tour leader for many years. So he's got some wonderful tours coming up. David is doing a tour in the south of France, part of the world that I have to say is very hard to resist. He's got a gorgeous Venice tour. I know that everyone who's done it has just raved about how wonderful it is. David does a lovely art and architecture tour of Sicily. And then he does a literary tour of Sicily with me. So it's literature and art. But this evening, David is going to be talking to us about the magical city of Ravenna and the church of San Vitale. So I'm delighted to welcome David Henderson to present this, what I'm sure will be a really wonderful talk.
Thank you, Susanna. And thank you everyone for joining me to, I hope, share with me my great enjoyment of this fascinating city. And in particular, I thought rather than give a very sort of general and perhaps superficial view of all of the monuments of Ravenna, and there are many, I thought I'd just maybe give firstly a little bit of an introduction to the sort of history and background of why Ravenna is a significant place. And then I wanted to focus on this one church, I would say the most important church in Ravenna, known as San Vitale. So Ravenna is a town on the Adriatic coast of Italy, sort of towards the north. By the way, I'm joining you here from Venice today, and Venice and Ravenna are kind of cities which have, I think, similar origins. They're both on the Adriatic coast. They're both, in their early history, very strongly connected to the Eastern Empire, to Byzantium, and they're both in sort of marshy settings. So there's a lot of similarities between Venice and Ravenna. And Venice, of course, went on to become one of the great sort of trading cities of the world, and a truly sort of magnificent urban centre. Ravenna, as we see it today, and there's an image of sort of present-day Ravenna, is a relatively unremarkable provincial town. It's rather quiet, it's very charming. It has all the nice things that we expect and to see and enjoy in northern Italian towns. There's pedestrian traffic, people having coffee under the umbrellas in the main square, they're perhaps riding around on bicycles. And all of this sort of rather quiet provincial life doesn't really prepare us for the splendour of the churches and in particular the mosaics of Ravenna. So behind these rather unremarkable walls is we see witness to a truly momentous time in history, I would say. And so here's a taste of the magnificent mosaic decoration in the church of San Vitale. So we go from this rather sort of commonplace provincial town, and we're suddenly immersed in a different world. We're really sort of overwhelmed by the beauty and the richness of these mosaics, and we're taken back to this very significant time in history. So why is Ravenna such an important place? Well, to think about that, we have to go back to antiquity, when the nearby town of Classe, C-L-A-S-S-E, Classe is the Latin word for fleet. So Classe is where the Roman fleet was stationed. It was a sort of a naval base at the time of the Emperor Augustus. And here we can see, again, a mosaic decoration in one of the churches of Ravenna, illustrating this port in a rather schematic way. So, a couple of centuries later, after it was a prominent port in antiquity, it's here represented as part of a mosaic showing sort of religious scenes. But by sort of late antiquity, because of the silting effect of the rivers, it wasn't such an important place. And it's interesting to note when you go to Ravenna that there are remnants of this ancient port that can be seen, and there are a couple of important churches. But the shoreline is actually about 7 kilometres, they think, from where it was in the time of ancient Rome, because of this silting effect. So Ravenna is on the edge of this great sort of agricultural plain, the Po river plain, and there are a number of important rivers, including the Po River, which flow into the sea nearby. So it has this very kind of marshy setting, and again, similar to Venice, which was one reason why it was chosen as an important sort of defensive location, a capital which had this excellent natural defence of the marshy surroundings. So here's Ravenna up here. I don't know if you can see on the map, just above Italia, where it says Italia. There's we can see Ravenna, and this is a map showing the Roman Empire in the time of the Emperor Diocletian, when he created the so-called tetrarchy. So he divided the empire up for reasons of security into these different administrative regions. Then, of course, we have the Emperor Constantine, who's an extremely important emperor. He's I think we can say that the two important things that Constantine does, which I hope will help me tell the story of Ravenna, is that he grants toleration to Christianity, the Edict of Milan. So Christianity becomes sort of the main religion of the Roman Empire, and he shifts the capital of the Roman Empire, of course, to the east, and the town of Byzantium gets renamed Constantinople after Constantine. So Constantine had this idea that rather than persecuting Christians, and they'd been persecuted up until shortly before his reign, and then of course he sort of conquers in the name of Christ, as it were, in the name of religion. He thought that the Christian religion was a very useful way of unifying his empire. So the kind of the administrative structures and indeed that kind of unity of belief was something that he hoped would help to maintain the integrity of the empire, even as it was sort of disintegrating and falling apart. And one of the ways he did this was to hold a series of councils to agree on the theology. Constantine, I don't think, was a particularly religious person himself, but wanted everybody to be on the same page, as it were, theologically. And so it was at the Council of Nicaea that the Arian heresy was denounced. And the Arian heresy was the first of these heresies, so-called, to challenge the mainstream Christian theology. And it's I think important to understand all of these different understandings of the Christian faith to get a good sense of what the Mosaics in Ravenna are about. So the principal challenge to what we call Orthodox Christianity that came from a so-called Bishop Arius, and he was the instigator of the so-called Arian heresy. And basically, the followers of Bishop Arius or Arius didn't believe in the divinity of Christ. And for Orthodox Christians, Christ was fully human and fully divine, and this fact was very important for understanding the true nature of Christ, and of course for the efficacy, shall we say, of Christ's salvation. So here we have a later representation here of an apocryphal scene at the Council of Nicaea, where Saint Nicholas, also known as Santa Claus, on the left, slaps Bishop Arius across the face. "You are wrong," he says. So, famous story, probably apocryphal, but a good indication of the kind of disputes that were going on at the time. And all of the theological disputes seem to be centered around this idea of Christ's two natures, his divine nature and his human nature on the other hand, and how they might be kind of combined in the person of Jesus Christ, and why this was important for salvation. So these were issues of absolutely vital interest at the time. And so Constantine might have been forgiven for thinking that he'd done away with this heresy and all was well, but not so much, because the so-called Gothic tribes, we sometimes call them the barbarian tribes of Northern Europe, these Germanic pastoralists and warriors, had also been converted to Christianity, but they'd been converted to the Arian version. And they were threatening the empire. This is the time of the sort of the disintegration of the Roman Empire, particularly in the West, through these the incursion of these tribes. And we've got this very complicated map here. Don't worry, I don't understand it either. It's all very sort of intertwined. But basically, these are Germanic tribes who are being pushed from the east, probably from tribes further east. I think this idea of Scary people coming from the east is at the very heart of the European imagination. So I've got all these Goths, the Ostrogoths, which are the Eastern Goths, the Visigoths who go into Spain, the Western Goths, and the authorities in Rome, because Rome and Milan and all these places are still important administrative centres in the West, decide to shift the capital to Ravenna again because it's got this naturally defensive, marshy surrounding. And also it's connected, as you can see, through the Adriatic Sea to Constantinople. So, of course, communication by sea is very important in these days. So it's the Emperor Honorius in, I think it's 402 AD, who shifts the capital of the Western Empire to Ravenna. So Ravenna goes from this rather unremarkable town to an imperial capital. And this is the beginning of the story of the importance of Ravenna. And a number of magnificent churches are built, which still exist today, now dating to the 5th and the 6th centuries, which bear witness to sort of imperial authority and to the dominance of Orthodox Christianity, or not, as the case may be. So this is the first period of Ravenna, that of the Roman emperors. And the last of the Roman emperors, here seen in a rather fanciful representation by a French 19th century academic painter, is called Romulus Augustulus. What an ironic name. He's the last of the emperors. He's a sort of an inadequate boy, as you can see here. His feet aren't even touching the ground from his throne. He's sort of overshadowed by the kind of the emblems of his authority almost. He's sort of overwhelmed by them. And in this period, we have it's very confusing. It's a quick succession of emperors, and the Gothic tribesmen, the Gothic warriors, who are not undertaking a sort of a systematic invasion of Italy. They are simply, through a combination of military action and migration, looking for pastures and for their herds, their pastoralists, and for a place for their families to settle. And they become mercenaries. Some of them achieve high rank in the Roman army. So it's all quite confusing. You're never really sure kind of who's in charge in this particular moment in history. And eventually one of Romulus Augustulus's high-ranking generals overthrows him in 476 AD. And this is one of the great dates of European history, the last Roman emperor in the West, 476 AD. And this general, a man named Odoacer, establishes his royal palace, the capital of his kingdom, again in Ravenna, because it's this imperial capital. The authorities in Constantinople are not very happy about this, and they send another Gothic commander, a man named Theodoric, to defeat him in battle, to lay siege to Ravenna, and to install himself instead as ruler. So he's a kind of a client or a puppet, if you like, of Constantinople. So this other Gothic Germanic general, Theodoric, lays siege to Ravenna. And it's interesting to note that in the few times that Ravenna gets defeated in military action under siege, it's not through actual sort of force of arms, but rather through deceit and subterfuge. So Theodoric manages to convince Odoacer that they've reached a stalemate and, look, we might as well just rule jointly. Why don't we do that? What a good idea. Odoacer is a sort of doesn't have quite the education, I imagine, as Theodoric, and he doesn't understand the significance of the date that Theodoric chooses for the great banquet to be held to celebrate the beginning of their joint kingship, I suppose you'd call it, which is the 15th of March, the Ides of March, fateful date. At a certain point in the banquet, Theodoric steps forward, draws out his sword, and as the chronicles say, cleaves him from collarbone to thigh in a single stroke. So that's the end of poor old Odoacer. Theodoric later mused to himself that it was as though the fellow had no bones in him. So his reign begins with a terrible act of betrayal and violence, and it also ends with an act of violence. He has the historian Boethius strangled. He gets very paranoid towards the end of his reign. But Theodoric's reign is considered to be a very good one. He rules over a very stable kingdom, and John Julius Norwich says he's one of the great statesmen of his day. I mean, we up until Charlemagne, we won't find a greater ruler, he says. And this is partly because Theodoric is able to reconcile all of these differing sort of belief systems, ethnic groups, and political and administrative people in his kingdom. In particular, he's able to ensure that the Arian Christians and the so-called Orthodox Christians exist happily side by side. And in fact, there is evidence of Arian churches in Ravenna itself. There's an Arian baptistry as well. And so all goes well until the time of Theodoric's death in, I think it's 425 AD. Here's the only, that's not really what Theodoric looks like in that sort of rather commercial sort of illustration, but here's a coin showing him. It's impossible to imagine he isn't blonde, is he, with his moustache and his sort of curly locks. And here's a coin showing the great ruler Theodoric. Theodoric the Great he's often referred to. And here's an idea of Theodoric's kingdom. You can see Italy and the area above it are what he rules. And from Ravenna, again, you can see on the map there. And you see in pink on the right-hand side, you'll see the Eastern Roman Empire. It's all appropriately enough in German, this map that I found on the internet. I feel as though I can understand German reading this. I've got those who understand German might be able to. I can understand we've got the Eastern Empire on the right in pink there, the Westgoten. These are going to be the Visigoths, the Western Goths. So it's a rather, it's sort of the beginnings of modern Europe in a way. We've got the Franks who have taken over France, and they'll give their name to that country, of course. And it's the time when the Angles, Saxons, and so on take over England. So it's a time of great flux. But Theodoric dies in 425 AD. Oh, these are two images from one of the Arian churches. And as I said, the debate is about the differing natures of Christ. And there are two strips of panels in the Church of Santa Apollinare Nuovo. One on one side showing Christ, the sort of the miracle worker, Christ, sort of the divine Christ. And on the other side, the human Christ of sort of the passion, the crucifixion, Christ who suffers and dies. And the thing that strikes me is how Roman these are. We've got a Christ on the left-hand side looking very much like a Roman emperor. That's meant to be purple, that colour that he's wearing, of course, denoting imperial rank, and he's accompanied by somebody who looks like a senator. And there's Lazarus being brought back to life. And on the right-hand side, Christ and his apostles all reclining in the ancient Roman style as they feast on two enormous fish. But what's interesting about these is that Christ of the miracles is shown as beardless, and the human Christ is shown with a beard. So again, it's a sort of a reference, and we're not really sure what the Arians are trying to tell us in this, what the exact symbolism is, but it's certainly a reference to these distinct and separate natures of Christ, which are, as I said, so much discussed at this time. Theodoric dies in 425, and it's got this extraordinary monument, this monumental tomb. So if you think, yes, I guess in a way we're in the Dark Ages, but people could still do some pretty impressive stuff. This is, beautifully cut stone. And it always astonishes me to see this, that when I see this, to think that the kind of the lid, as it were, the dome on the tomb is a single piece of stone that they've just cut out. God knows how they got it up there. So it's a really one of the great monuments of Ravenna. And a good introduction to some of the forms of early Christian architecture. This is a building which has a centralised plan, and buildings with centralised plan usually had the function of sort of monuments to great people, memorials, some sort of commemoration of death or of an important person. So it's one of the forms from which, the templates from which Christian architecture emerges. And we've got two kinds, really. We've got the longitudinal form on the left. That's the plan of Old St. Peter's, which doesn't exist anymore. It's been replaced by the current one, of course, built by the Emperor Constantine. And on the right-hand side, the Church of Santa Costanza, which is obviously on a circular plan. So the longitudinal and the circular are the two building types which stand at the beginning of Christian architecture. And generally speaking, in the West, the longitudinal form prevails, and in the East, the circular form is the dominant form. And that's appropriate in a way. Eastern Christianity has got this sense of hierarchy, the sort of the dome of heaven above, and the sort of the verticality of the space. There's a sort of a mysticism about the divine perfection of a circle, I suppose, a contemplative quality. And that's in keeping with the more, I suppose, the great sort of theological and philosophical traditions of the East. And in the West, the plan is more about, it's more down to earth. It's the Christian religion expressed through a kind of a narrative. And the narrative in this that's embodied in this plan is that journey from the earthly entrance to the sacred altar and apse. So from the earthly entrance at the bottom of this plan on the left, travelling along the main axis of the building, that horizontal axis, to the altar, the presbytery, and so on. And sometimes these two forms get blended. In one of the great buildings of the world, really, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, now Istanbul, we see a kind of a merging of these two plans. So if we look at the plan here of Hagia Sophia, built by the Emperor Justinian, who I'll be discussing in a little bit more detail in a minute, we can see that there is a sort of a longitudinal drive, a longitudinal sort of emphasis to the plan, but there's also that large circular dome. And what a wonderful space it is. Truly one of the great buildings of the world. And it's actually contemporary with the Church of San Vitale and has many things in common with it. So with the death of King Theodoric, there's as so often happens, there's a crisis of succession. The regent, who's the woman, I think it's his niece, who was meant to be acting as regent, is murdered. This is, it creates a chaotic power vacuum and presents the Byzantines, the authorities in Constantinople, with the perfect excuse to invade Italy, which they do in the 5th century. Here again, we've got another centralized plan, the baptistry. I want to talk briefly about, I'm quite interested in the idea of sacred geometry and the symbolism of geometry and how this is incorporated into buildings. So, as I said, in the West, the longitudinal form tended to prevail, but in the East, it's the centralized form. But we do get some centralized buildings like baptistries in the West. And the baptistry, particularly in Italy, is a distinct and a separate building with a very specific symbolism. In particular, that symbolism is tied to the shape of the octagon, the octagonal plan. And the octagon we can connect with ideas of harmony, with the octave in music. And in the context of the baptistry, the symbolism is also that of the 7 days of the week. And the 8th side, representing the 8th day in the octagon, is an allusion to sort of that, I suppose, that time which stands outside of time, so eternity. Baptistries have also got a connection with the idea of death in baptistry and baptism. The idea is that you were you die and then you were reborn again in Christ. And the other symbolism connected with the octagon is that it is a kind of a transitional form, if you think about it, between the earthly square and a square, representing the earth, anything that's got the number 4, so the 4 seasons, the 4 elements, that sort of thing. So it's the earthly square and the divine perfection of the circle. The octagon is somewhere, it's a kind of a transitional form between those two things. And I don't know if I'm being a bit fanciful here, but we see the octagon in buildings like the wonderful Castel del Monte in Puglia, much later than San Vitale, built by the great intellectual Frederick II, which we could, I think, interpret as a sort of again, this idea of a transition between earth and heaven, perhaps a symbol of his divine mandate to rule. And the same can be said, and you weren't expecting to see a picture of Beijing's Forbidden Palace here, but the octagon on the ceiling of the Forbidden Palace has been interpreted in a similar way. It's that transition between earth and heaven. It's the shape that's somewhere between a circle and a square. And we know that the Chinese considered themselves to be living in the middle kingdom, that kingdom between heaven and earth. So perhaps something of that symbolism of the octagon, we can say, is embodied in the plan of San Vitale, which we see here. It's a most extraordinary building, quite contemporary with Hagia Sophia and also with other buildings in Istanbul, in particular the Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, which is also referred to as a little Hagia Sophia. So if we think about all those buildings as belonging to that particular moment in time, so the San Vitale presents itself as really these sort of 2 octagons. It's the external walls we can see here, and a series of, it's almost like the form of a flower, these apse-like structures, these sort of semicircular hexedra structures, which create this incredibly sort of complex and sophisticated spaces, and which are also lit by many windows. So the play of space and light is very important here. So San Vitale is very much a kind of a classical building in that it's based on simple geometry, it's based on axiality and symmetry, but it's doing something new and something different. So it represents a real innovation in architecture. And again, I enjoy one of the things everyone enjoys in Ravenna, and which I think was intentional, was that you come to these exteriors. And I mean, San Vitale, as you can see, it's quite a grand building made of brick, but very plain on the exterior. And you walk through these unadorned brick walls, and you're sort of immersed in this wonderland of colour and pattern and gold and sort of the richness of design. So I think that sort of contrast between interior and exterior, which part of what makes Ravenna such an enchanting place, you really are immersed in a different world. So back to the architecture. Here we can see these niche-like forms, which I think treat the space in a different way. They allow almost the space to pass through them. We've got two levels here. In the early Christian church, men and women worshipped separately. So that upper floor is a little bit like sort of boxes at the opera, I suppose, is known as the matroneum. That was where the women congregated on that upper story. And it has this wonderful sort of use of light as well. And the light is very important, of course, for illuminating the mosaics and creating effects on the mosaics. I mean, perhaps one way of understanding the space of San Vitale is to compare it to something like the Pantheon. In the Pantheon, we have this very simple geometry. We have spaces which are very clearly defined and a sort of a geometry which is very sort of precise and explicit in a way. Whereas in Ravenna, we have something different happening, which is to do with an emphasis on surface, an emphasis on light, and spaces which kind of leak into other spaces, as it were. And here's the church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, which you can still visit in Istanbul today. Now, of course, a mosque. But so you can see that Ravenna is looking very much not to Roman architecture, to its ancient Roman heritage, but rather to the east. And we don't exactly know who the architects were and how they were influenced, but it's obviously there is some connection to what's going on in Istanbul at the time. Ravenna is dominated by this wonderful dome, and very sophisticated construction techniques. Unlike maybe they looked at Theodoric's dome and thought, "There's no way we're going to do that." And the dome is actually built with these hollow clay vessels, so that it's very light and at the same time very strong. And we, as with so many churches in Italy, we have to kind of block out from our view the fresco decoration of the dome because it's of a much later date. So it's at least over 1,000 years later. So the style is completely different, and it's completely out of keeping with the mosaic decorations. And probably in other contexts would be interesting to see, but we have to concentrate on the mosaics, which are concentrated around that apse area, which is the part that we see directly in front of us. Again, the architecture is there's this emphasis on flatness. And again, I've made a comparison with the Pantheon, a Corinthian column. There are all sorts of rules that you have to follow with classical architecture. And again, it's very sculptural. You really get a sense that there's an understanding of all of those sort of acanthus leaves coming out of the column on the right and projecting out at various angles into space. There's an understanding of this object very much as a three-dimensional thing, as a sort of a sculptural plastic form. And on the left-hand side, we think that the designers of Ravenna are trying to come up with something completely new and original, a new classical yet Christian architecture. So there's a sort of a denial of form, of the material, I suppose. Everything becomes flattened. There's this lovely sort of flat ornamental screen that the column has become. Those aren't ponies, by the way, above that. They're lambs, so they're a very common Christian symbol. And they are in this what's called an impost block above the capital. So you can see that in Ravenna, just about every surface in this presbytery area is covered with either carving or ornament or mosaic or some kind of coloured marble. This is of the presbytery area, which is where all the mosaic decoration is is concentrated. So here we walk through this kind of triumphal arch, and again we've got a representation of Christ at the very top, a bearded Christ, and I suppose this is the kind of the human Christ as much as anything else, who looks out with this very frontal gaze. Again, we're moving towards a kind of a flatness in decoration, that the third dimension becomes less important. And he's surrounded by these wonderful sort of dolphin-like creatures and a kind of a frame, a circular frame with this extraordinary sort of rainbow colour. So it's almost like sort of impressionist painting in a way, mosaic. It's these little tesserae, these little cubes of stone which are placed side by side to create an impression in the eye. They need to be read from quite a distance. The mosaics are either of glass, specially made of a certain colour. Sometimes they can be of stone, and sometimes they're of gold. And of course, it's the gold that creates the greatest impression. And one of the reasons I think why that makes the Ravenna mosaics so extraordinary is just a deep understanding of colour harmony. And the first impression, I think, is of gold and green. And I always think certainly in a painting, it's the overall harmony that matters. That's what takes you in first. That's what holds the image together. And certainly there are other things that can happen in the painting, of course. But if you don't have that, the image is never going to cohere in the way that it should. And I think that sort of first impression of harmony that one sees in Ravenna is what gives it that sort of weight of, as it were, pictorial or visual authority. And so you can see we've got this intricate interweaving of decoration, which is based on sort of late antique ornament. And we do have the third dimension here. I don't know if you can see that, those sort of ribbon-like forms under the arch. We have other kind of architectural forms. We have vegetal ornament. We have Christian symbols, all kind of woven together seamlessly. So the vine that you can see along the top of that arch, that sort of grapevine, there's an obvious Christian symbolism to that, the Eucharistic vine. The peacock is another common Christian symbol. The peacock represents immortality. And the way in which the decorations are so beautifully integrated into the architecture, I think, is very impressive. Here again, you can see that wonderful green and gold harmony. And I like the way that the structure of that vault, we're looking up into a vault, is expressed in the mosaic ornament, in those sort of four lines that all draw the eye up to the image of the Lamb in the centre. And this is echoed by the four angels, kind of almost like caryatids holding up an architectural element. So we've got the Lamb in the very centre. Again, an obvious Christian symbol, the sacrificial lamb, the paschal lamb, which is supported by these angels. But you can see here the extensive use of gold. The gold tiles are they're sort of like little mirrors. They're basically a bit of gold leaf sandwiched between two pieces of glass. And I think here's a detail of one of the mosaics. And I think it's important to remember too that these mosaic tiles are not laid in an even way. So the faces are not all perfectly aligned with each other. They're deliberately laid so that the mosaic tesserae or tiles will catch the light in a different way. And again, this sort of is a way of bringing the image to life, the way the light plays over it. So that it's very deliberately made to maintain this extraordinary sense of vitality, of movement, of life. This shows the priest king Melchizedek from the Old Testament, here paired with Abel, and both of them are giving an offering up to God. And this idea of a sacred offering is perhaps the dominant theme in the iconography of Ravenna. And there's a nice pairing there. Melchizedek, the priest king. Again, this is a reference to the Emperor Justinian, who has a kind of a priestly dimension as well. He's paired rather nicely with this rather sort of rustic-looking Abel with his hut, Melchizedek with his grand temple behind him, and the hand of God coming down, accepting the two offerings that they give up. Similarly, the stories of Abraham, who encounters these three mysterious men who come to his home, and he offers them a newborn calf, He slaughters a newborn calf and offers it to them to eat, rather sort of comically shown, this little miniature bull on a plate, symbolically shown. And the angels sort of tell him that his wife Sarah will have a child. So this miraculous child is born. Sarah's standing in their home, sort of pondering this mysterious prophecy. And then on the right-hand side, of course, the sacrifice of Abraham, the son who's born Isaac. So again, this idea of offering, the offering of the calf to the three mysterious strangers who are angels, in fact, as we can see from their halos, and then the offering of his firstborn son to God, who fortunately, you can see at the last minute, comes down and stays his hand so he doesn't have to kill him. And they've got the ram there that he kills instead. So again, this idea of sacrifice and offering. So it's all related to the symbols, I suppose, of the Eucharist, which are connected very much to the sacrifice of Christ, Christ's divinity, and this idea of the different natures of Christ. So the imagery is interwoven with the big theological ideas of the day. Then in the apse here, we have, again, a sort of images of offering, an image of Christ. Again, I think interesting to note that he's a beardless Christ. So this is the divine Christ. This is the living God, as it were. The Z on his toga-like robe, his purple robe, is said to be the first letter of the word Zoe, the Greek word for life. So again, this sort of the living God, the both human and divine Christ figure. And he's enthroned like an emperor. And again, we have sort of echoes of the sort of the priestly, as I said, dimension of the emperor himself. And he's offering a crown, a sign of divine favor, to San Vitale. This is the titular saint of the church on the left-hand side, who's dressed like a Byzantine courtier, as are the angels. And on the right-hand side, Bishop Ecclesius, who was the founder of the church, shall we say. And he's offering, again, a model of San Vitale to Christ, again, ushered into the presence of the emperor/Christ. And it all takes place in this wonderful gold background in a kind of a representation, I suppose, of paradise. The four rivers of paradise are flowing from the feet of Christ, and a very lyrical description of a kind of a garden, I suppose. Paradise with flowers, all these different shades of green. And like everything in the Church of San Vitale, all represented with this extraordinary sort of vivacity of form and the sense that there's sort of burgeoning life which animates literally every mosaic tile. The whole thing is just sort of is brimming with this kind of vital energy. Christ holds in his left hand, that's on the right-hand side, the seven seals, the sort of apocalyptic seals, a reminder of the kind of end of days. And I think it's interesting in this particular moment in the Christian religion, people actually believed that the world was going to end. That was part of what the Christian religion was about. The world will come to an end. The living and the dead alike will be judged. So there's sort of a reference to that as well. But so Christ sitting on a kind of a circular form. Some have suggested that's the universe, or perhaps it's the earth. So again, his throne is sort of the earth, as it were. So this is all kind of imagery that's kind of being worked out as they make it. So it's not really dependent on any existing conventions. I get the sense that this is one of the first of the sort of the so-called Pantocrators, these sort of Christ as judge and ruler that sits at the apses of great churches, like the much later ones, like the ones we see in Monreale, or perhaps Cefalù in Sicily, and in the great sort of Byzantine churches of the Eastern world. So we come to the sort of the most famous of the mosaics in Ravenna, depictions of the Emperor Justinian and his court. So Justinian, as I said, took it upon himself to invade Italy from Constantinople. There was this crisis of succession in the court of Theodoric, and he thought this was the perfect moment to realise a great sort of romantic dream almost, to realise this ambition of, let's say, making the empire great again, of reuniting the old Western Empire with the East as it was before, but perhaps even greater than before, because at this time it would be united under the Orthodox faith. And with his able general Belisarius, who we see on Justinian's right, our left, the chap there. He embarked upon a war which took almost 20 years to execute. It was sort of dragged out forever, but which was eventually successful. So is here represented in the presbytery of San Vitale as a kind of an imperial presence. In fact, he never went to Ravenna. He never visited Ravenna, but in a sense, he's the person, one of the people we most associate with Ravenna, the city of Ravenna, and the Church of San Vitale, because of this very famous and very beautiful representation. So I think there's a shift in this particular mosaic from the earlier kinds of mosaic, which still maintain a vestigial sense of three dimensions. Yes, they are very flattened and abstract, but we go a little bit further in this representation of Justinian. We've got a very flat gold background. There's a sort of a frontality to all of these figures. They're looking straight out at us. There's no sense of showing a three-quarter view, or really of very much modelling with light and shade to make things look three-dimensional. So we're going even further towards this sense of denying the sort of the physical, the material, and creating what you might call a spiritualized image. And they stand on this undifferentiated sort of ground. Fantastic detail. I love all their shoes. Aren't they great? And so Justinian is flanked by the agents of his secular and spiritual authority. So as we've seen on the left, we've got wonderful portraits of his generals. Depictions of the soldiers are not, they're rather more generalized people. They're not meant to be specific individuals. With their shield with the Chi-Rho symbol, that's the first two letters in Greek of the word Christ, Christos. And this was on the shields of the soldiers of Constantine when he conquered his rival general Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, the Chi-Rho symbol. So very much a sense that God is on our side. And on the right-hand side, on Justinian's left, we see Archbishop Maximianus, who was the bishop at the time. Ravenna was, or the Church of San Vitale was finished. And he's flanked by two deacons. But they're wonderful portraits, I think, of individuals, and extraordinary that they've been able to create these such vivid likenesses in such an unforgiving medium as mosaic. And here was a nice shot, I think, of a close-up of that particular portrait. And again, it's a little bit like Impressionist painting. It's little patches of colour placed side by side so that at a distance they all read as a sort of a coherent representation of an object, in this case, the human face. But you really do get a sense of the presence of a very specific individual. And I think it's interesting too, the way that they use colour in this. I mean, if you look at there are details in his hair, for instance, which are almost an intense violet, and the sort of shadow between the kind of the side of the nose on the left-hand side of the nose there is done in an intense orange, as are the lips. But if you look, I don't know if you can see on the right-hand side there, you can see the face. We're not aware of those intense colours in the face. But they kind of read at a distance. They give a greater sort of weight and richness to the final image. So it's fascinating to see how the artists who made these would have understood how the technique reads at different distances. And we've got all sorts of interesting materials used here. The gold again, we've got glass, we've got stone, we've even got little circles of mother of pearl. So this love of kind of rich pattern and colour is very much characteristic of the Byzantine style. And perhaps even more famous than the depiction of Justinian is that of his wife, the Empress Theodora. Here she's shown in a slightly more defined setting. Perhaps it's a courtyard with a fountain. She's shown in a niche, almost like a statue. But again, the emphasis on frontality. It's on it's flatness, on pattern. And unfortunately, this image, I couldn't really find any really good images. I suppose they're quite hard to photograph, being up in such awkward places and with varying lighting conditions. But you just have to go and see them yourselves in person. They are, the colour, in particularly in this one, is absolutely spectacular. Those sort of rich greens and golds and subtle greys, purpley browns. It really is the work of people who had an extremely sophisticated understanding of colour harmony and pattern. It really is quite spectacular. It's sort of overwhelmingly lovely, these mosaics, I think. So the famous Theodora. And it's interesting that Justinian and Theodora get equal billing. Women seem to play a much greater or more important role politically in the Byzantine East than they do in the West. And in fact, one of the reasons why Charlemagne was able to convince the Pope that he should become Emperor of the West, because there was already an emperor, there was still an emperor in Constantinople at that time. He said, well, in fact, there was an empress, and he said, well, according to a law I've just discovered or whatever, or something that's written down somewhere, a woman is not a legitimate ruler, and so you need to make me Emperor of the West. And so women had always played, I think, a very important role in the East. You're often hearing about sort of women making important decisions and having and wielding considerable amounts of political power. And Theodora was no exception. Theodora and Justinian are considered saints in the Eastern Church, but that is not the impression we get if we read one of the few descriptions of Theodora's life written by an historian, a contemporary historian called Procopius. And Procopius writes a very sort of a celebrated book called The Secret History, in which he describes the sort of the character of Theodora and something of her early life. And perhaps he was a bit of a snob. Both Justinian and Theodora came from very humble origins, and Theodora's father was a bear keeper in the Hippodrome in Constantinople, and he died at a young age. And she, according to Procopius, not only became a prostitute, but she also became an actress who put on shows of a very, shall we say, questionable nature. And it's hilarious to read Procopius, because even as he's denouncing all the appalling behaviour of Theodora, he feels the need to describe it in ever more sort of minute detail, and you really do get a strong sense that he's rather enjoying sort of imagining all the goings on. So it's a very entertaining read. Historians today take it with a grain of salt, but she clearly was, from Procopius's descriptions in The Secret Life and also the Secret History, and also in other accounts of her, that she must have been a truly remarkable woman. And the nice thing is, I think, that the marriage of Theodora and Justinian was what appears to be a love match. Justinian, when he was a high court official, had a law change that forbade high officials from marrying actresses, specifically so that he could marry Theodora, who he had as the French say, a coup de foudre. He was struck by lightning when he met her. And not only that, when he soon after became emperor, he made Theodora his co-ruler, so she ruled alongside him with equal power. So she must have been an extraordinary lady, and accounts of her do suggest that she was a person of great sort of political astuteness and intelligence and will, and courage. So she was. So she's one of the sort of the most fascinating figures of her time. I think we have all these sort of accounts that hint at who she might have been, but of course it's so long ago we'll never really know. So here she is, flanked by the ladies of her court. That's one of the women. I think the one directly to her left, to our right, is the wife of General Belisarius, who was a very close friend of hers. And the other woman is, I think, one of her daughters from a previous marriage. She'd been the concubine of a sort of a high official in North Africa before she met Justinian. Had a very colourful life, we can imagine. And on her left are the eunuchs. Eunuchs played a very important role in the politics and in court life of Constantinople. So a fascinating glimpse into the court at Constantinople in all its kind of richness and hierarchy and ritual. And in fact, these scenes, they're very frontal, but there is that sort of slight sense of a movement, in this case from right to left. It's a solemn, sacred procession towards the altar, and the other scene goes in the opposite direction because it's on the flanking side of the presbytery. So they're a kind of little snapshot of this elaborate court ritual. And that sense of the procession is echoed. If you look at the hem of Theodora's garment, you can see a representation of the three magi who are again giving gifts. So again, this theme of offering gifts, of making a sacred offering, is continued. And Theodora here holds a kind of a large, it's like a chalice sort of a thing that for the what we'd call the communion wine, the sort of the Eucharistic wine, and Justinian has got something which holds sort of a loaf of bread, so that it's got that sort of sacred Eucharistic dimension as well. And you can see that both Theodora and Justinian they're not really halos. They weren't saints when these were made. They later became saints. But again, a reminder of the kind of the sacred dimension associated with the role of the emperor. So it's a kind of the Byzantine emperor is a kind of a theocrat in a way. He's not like we don't really have quite that separation of church and state in Byzantium that we later have in the West. So it has that extra sort of layer, shall we say, of mystique attached to it. So here we have these imperial representations, which are, again, it's all about emphasizing the authority of Constantinople at the end of this terrible war. Strangely enough, so it's an interesting thought, I think, that this wonderful and Gesamtkunstwerk, this total work of art of San Vitale, of extraordinary importance, is made during a war. Not only during a war, but there's a terrible bubonic plague which lasted for years. So it makes me think, you don't necessarily need ideal conditions to create great works of art. So with the conquests of Justinian, Ravenna is then ruled by exarchs, and its sort of glory is short-lived because another sort of invasion establishes a different kind of power in Italy soon after. The Lombards, who are a very fierce Germanic tribe, invade. They establish a kingdom in northern Italy. They establish various duchies. And so the influence of the East is gradually diminished. And Ravenna lapses back into being this rather quiet provincial town. It's sort of moment of glory passes. So I hope that's been a little bit of an introduction to something of the magic, I think, of the city of Ravenna. I've shown you a couple of images here, obviously, but as I say, they really only give us sort of a shadow of the true sort of richness and beauty of the mosaics when you see them in person, in real life. So thank you, everyone, and please ask me any questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, David. That was really fascinating. I have been to that church, but it was over 30 years ago, so definitely time for a revisit, I think. So does anyone have questions they would like to ask David? Feel free to unmute, turn your photos back on, and let us know if you've got questions.
Yeah, so with that last image, was that the blue and red and white banner thing up in the right-hand corner? So well, that's what the colours look like to me. I mean,
yes, yeah,
they're sort of significant colours.
Not that I know of. No, it looks a bit. You think it might be a sort of an early version of the Italian flag?
Or maybe it wasn't blue. Maybe it was green. I don't know.
Yes, no, I think it's. I think a lot. I think all of those things are just put there to increase the sense of richness in both the sense of rich materials and kind of visual richness. No, it doesn't have a.
David, how much can the visitor see from way down below in terms of this detail? Do they provide you with any equipment to look at?
Sadly, no. I think no? I mean, often a lot of people bring little sort of opera glasses to look at things, and I suppose these days when you can always you can zoom in with your phone quite well these days.
That's a great idea.
But as I say, I think to me, as I said, it's that impression of colour. It's that sort of magic of the colour harmonies, the richness of the gold, and to see these sort of faces peering out at you from 1,500 years ago is.
I haven't seen anything like that before.
They're quite unique, and I meant to mention too that they're all the more valuable because in about sort of 200 years after they were made, they had in the East something called the iconoclastic crisis, where they, again, to do with these different natures of Christ, they decided it was blasphemous to make religious images, and a little bit like they did in sort of Protestant England or somewhere, they went around destroying them all. So, but that didn't happen in the West; that only happened in the East. So, something like Ravenna is all the more valuable because it's so rare.
At Exeter Cathedral, when I was there, they had these trolleys with mirrors on them that you could push around, and would be reflected in the mirror, and you didn't have to keep your head up the whole time.
That would be nice.
Some years ago, I had the good fortune to go and do a mosaic making course in Ravenna for a couple of weeks. I had the misfortune to be no good at it, but it sort of allowed me some time in the city to look at everything. And the thing that struck me the most was the picture of Justinian and Belisarius opposite their wives. They're two conniving wives, according to Profusion.
Yeah.
And these two incredibly powerful women, Theodora and Antonia, I think, had an enormous influence, according to what you can believe, on their two husbands, and sometimes sort of brought them back from the brink and said, "Get a hold of yourself." And they are two incredibly fascinating women that are sort of worth a bit more looking into, I think.
Yeah, no, that's good. And there's what you probably know, that wonderful story of the riot that takes place, and it looks as though that the mob is going to storm the palace and they'll all be killed. And Justinian sort of looking anxiously out the window at these ships in the harbour, thinking, well, shouldn't we be making a move, everyone? And Theodora stands up and makes, according to, we don't really know what she said, but the way it's recounted, she says, don't be such a, spineless wimp. We need to stand up to these people. And she ends her speech with, the purple is the noblest winding sheet, which is to say, we should die in our imperial robes if we're going to die, kind of thing.
I think she said that what allegedly, whatever else you could slink off and do was nothing compared to being emperor and empress. So we'll fight.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. If you sort of renounce your title, then you're nobody. But even though you might die, it's better to remain like that. Yes. And then he rallied, and they defeated the mob and survived. So she could. According to that story, she can be credited with really, giving her husband the moral support that he needed at that crucial moment, which is extraordinary. Yeah.
From Robert, he asks, do you know anything of the artisans who created the mosaics, and have the colours faded?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, we don't really know. I mean, they would have been teams of artisans. Probably they were mostly from Constantinople. There might have been some local people working in there. And no, I don't think the mosaics really fade. They have been restored, and I think that I'm not an expert on it, but there are going to be some mosaics which have, and you can see in other churches in Ravenna that mosaics have been badly restored, so that the colours will keep their intensity because they're minerals. I mean, they're either glass, which will, is more or less going to last forever, as will stone. I can't imagine stone really fading, and gold, of course, doesn't fade. But the mosaics will come away. That's how they deteriorate, rather than through fading. And the danger is that they get restored by, somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing. So yes, I think we need to think of that art from that period. It's not like sort of post-Renaissance art. We have these great individuals, your Michelangelos and your Rembrandts and so on. It tended to be more anonymous in those days, I guess. So we don't really have any record of who did them.
Well, I think we can be grateful they've left such a wonderful legacy. I'd like you all now to join me in thanking David for a really fascinating talk. I think it's made every one of us want to hurry off to Ravenna as soon as possible to see those wonderful mosaics. And I think we've all learned so much about the history leading up to the building of the church. It's been absolutely fascinating, David. So thank you very much from all of us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Susanna.
And thank you all for joining us.